NPatch is a technique for drawing and scaling textures in 2 or 1 dimensions. Ordinarily, if you want to scale a texture, it's actually fairly trivial. In raylib, we can draw a texture, set the destination rectangle, and assuming the destination rectangle does not match whatever the native size of the texture is, then scaling will occur. When you want to display a small texture over a large area, sometimes you want to use some kind of tiling system, sometimes you're happy with a standard stretch. But in particular, when it comes to UI, the type of stretching that you want to do is usually segmented. Take, for instance, this little border texture here. I got this from a Kenney UI pack. We'll be looking at it a little bit more later. This image here, if we were to stretch this natively, it's not exactly the effect that we're looking for. Really what we want is for the edges, like this edge portion here and each of the other edges, to be stretched on their own, or maybe tiled, though I will just get ahead and say raylib does not support that with NPatch by default. The corners should be placed exactly. No stretching should occur. The horizontal edges should only stretch horizontally, the vertical edges should only stretch vertically, and then the center can be stretched or tiled. Now, in the case of raylib, we're only looking at stretching options. If you want NPatch that does have tiling, you're going to have to implement that drawing yourself, and maybe that's something we can look at in a future video, but it's a fairly large scope idea. The tiling doesn't always have to be 3x3 though. Here we have something that clearly needs to be tiled vertically, so we can see that there is 12 pixels at the top. I'm using IrfanView here, and when I select, you'll notice the title bar updates to say the size of the selection. So it's actually this. It's a little tricky sometimes. So there we go. So I can see the first 12 pixels of the top are dedicated to this little decoration, and at the bottom it's another 12 pixels. And then the middle is something that realistically could be stretched or tiled endlessly, and it wouldn't have any sort of weird repeating artifacts or anything like that. It would just be a clean straight line. And just for completeness of example, we also have one that can be stretched or tiled horizontally. Now in this case, the part that is preserved is like maybe a few pixels in the middle. Like we're talking, I don't know, maybe not much more than 16 pixels in the middle, when the whole image is 256, or sorry, 512, even bigger. But we'll see what we can do with this shortly. For now, I want to talk a little bit more simply about the basic way that NPatch is set up. And so I have a really basic texture here. All right, well, IrfanView lasted for about 15 seconds because I need to not show the image like that. So I'm going to use PaintNet instead. So this image is 3x3. It's a pretty small texture. The idea is this is really the minimum that we need to demonstrate what I'm talking about here. The idea is that the center is one type of patch, and then you have the 2 vertical line patches, so that would be the orange and the light blue here. And then you have the horizontal patches, which are the purple and the lime, and then the corners. So typically you would have you'd have the option to have a different scaling algorithm for each of the patches, or each of the patch types. So the corners would have one setting, the horizontal could have one setting, the vertical could have one, and then the center could have its own. So sometimes, like I said, in different implementations, you can see the ability to tile or stretch. Horizontal patches will never be scaled vertically. Vertical patches will never be scaled horizontally. The corners will be pasted as is with no modification, and the center will be stretched. As for the horizontal patches, they'll be stretched horizontally, and the vertical patches stretched vertically. So no tiling is offered. As for pasting the corners, it's not super clear why until we go into a different example. So this one we can see the corners have like a rounding to them, right? So if you could imagine, if we were to draw this texture at a ratio, like this is a square texture, but if I wanted to draw it for a panel, this is the border of a panel, and that panel is twice as wide as it is tall. If I was to draw it as a normal texture, these corners would stretch in a very odd way. It would totally break the effect of this border, this banner that we're trying to create. Okay, these textures look exactly as we expect. Raylib does default to the nearest neighbor scaling, but we're drawing both of these as a square. So what I'm gonna do is take each of these and extend them horizontally. So we can see when we extend them horizontally, now they kind of look funny. Now they're skewed because I'm imagining it being like a panel, like I'm saying. I'm already thinking about what the NPatch is going to look like. And so that's really not the effect that we're getting. Now, something that is a little bit annoying with the NPatch in raylib is we don't have the option for scale either. So if I want to get these to actually be an accurate comparison, I'm going to have to scale up the original images. Okay, so I'm just confirming they still look the same now that I've increased the size. Now what I'm going to do is we're going to try drawing them with NPatch. DrawTextureNPatch is like DrawTexture Pro, except that we no longer use a rectangle source, but instead we provide an NPatchInfo. NPatchInfo is a struct that has a source rectangle, which is part of the reason why it replaces that parameter, and it has 4 ints to specify how many pixels from the left, top, right, and bottom we should consider where the center begins, because if we provide these 4 floats, that is going to define the slices for the 9patch. Lastly, there's also this layout int, which maps to NPatch layout. You can see there's these 3 values here. So 9patch is the default. And then we also have a 3patch for vertical and a 3patch for horizontal. So we'll check those out later. So we start with the source rectangle, which I've already defined. And then we need the 3 ints. The way that I've set up these images, it's basically they're clean thirds. So I just need a clean third of 216, which is 72. And lastly, we need the layout. I'll just leave it as, I'll put nothing and then I'll default to it, or we can just write NPatch 9patch to explicitly set it as being the one we want. Of course, leaving it blank, it will be the same. In this case, for simplicity, I've specifically authored the textures to use this sort of third layout, and they're both the same. I've scaled them up to be the same size. So in this case, the numbers are different. But if I had used the original texture where it was really 3x3, these would all be 1s. And if I had used the original one where it was 27x27, these would all be 9s. So now after drawing these textures, I'm going to modify the destination. So all we need to do differently here, now that I've updated the destination rectangles, is we change the DrawTexture Pro to DrawTextureNPatch, and like I said, replace the source rectangles with our infos, and we'll see how it looks. So you can see here how it has differently handled the horizontal stretch. So we can see the corners, which were previously very distorted by the stretch, are now preserved exactly as is. And as I said, the vertical patches do not receive any horizontal scaling. They are vertical patches, they only receive vertical scaling. When I was saying earlier that raylib's NPatch drawing doesn't support scaling, what I mean is that in other implementations, for example in Unity's sprite slicing implementation, I could change the scaling of this NPatch texture, and what that would mean is I could set it to 0.5 and the corners and edges would be half the size that they are now, but the full rectangle would be the same size. I could also make the scale double, and then they would be a lot closer to being what these are like, except that they would still fit this uniform style where they stay proportionally correct. Part of the reason I say this is so annoying is because if I decide those borders are a little bit too thick in raylib with the default implementation, I need to take these into my editor, resize them by 50%, and save this as a new texture. The NPatch drawn panels look much better now. The borders are much thinner, which is what I wanted, and I could go even thinner still by using an even smaller scaled image. I'm going to pivot now to a sample that I created earlier, which uses those Kenney textures, and it's just a little bit more interactive so we can see the impact of each of these different settings. So we can see this is the banner that we saw the texture from earlier. And if you recall, this banner was 512 wide, but this window is 1024 by 1024. And of course, if you do look fairly closely, you can see the banner flattens out by the time we get to about the first quarter from either side. And the rest of it is just it's that single, I think it was like 16 pixels or so, and those have been stretched horizontally to fill the rest of the space. And because they're all identical, it's a clean stretch. There's not like some annoying distortion as you go along. Just to be clear, if you hadn't used NPatch, it would look like this. I have a debug option here to make it so the right edge of the banner will follow my mouse. And we can see as I come closer, if I get close to what would be 512, which was the native size, then they basically look identical because I'm basically drawing them both the same way. No matter what you do with the second version, if you're not using NPatch, it's just messy. It's not going to work. So this is an example of how that would break down for the horizontal case. We also have another panel example, so this was one of the Kenney ones. So we can see if I draw it with NPatch and I draw it normal, then we have that same issue we were having before where the border is really thick, right? Not only that, but if I switch to using mouse controls again, then we can see as I make it horizontal, that problem gets worse and worse. So now, again, the left and right edges of the rectangle are super thick and the top and bottom are actually quite thin. And I can even make this worse. I can make it quite narrow. And we can see the top panel is taking all of this sizing basically in its stride. The only things that are a little bit not ideal, I believe that this texture was intended to be tiled. And so we are seeing a little bit of the fuzziness at the top there, where there is that sort of little triangle that comes out, it's looking very stretched. Realistically, it probably should be tiled. It would look a little bit better, but even still, the shape of the panel is actually makes sense. The shape of this bottom one, like you would never want to use this. It doesn't look fitting. Lastly, there is a scroll bar. So this is similar to the banner, except now we're talking about vertical instead of horizontal. So we have it, I just have it set to a particular size here. I quite like this. And actually, if I use mouse controls, we can see I can pull it all the way down and it looks perfectly fine. And you might think, well, this is kind of like this one more than any seems like it wouldn't be such a big deal. But just to remind you, this is what it would look like if you drew it normally. So here is when it's about right, because it's about native. And as we stretch, look at that, right? That's not what you want. Hopefully this gives you a good idea of why NPatch is necessary and where are some of the cases that you might actually want to use it. Now, I've already shown you how to create an NPatchInfo and how to draw a texture with NPatch, but what I haven't shown you is how to take a texture that you've already made and convert it to use this system. Some time ago, I was making a very simple web game for myself and my friends to play, and I had created a style of button that I quite liked, which is this one here, and I have reused something like this quite a few times. The way that I had made the buttons at the time was I had created this button shape in Photoshop, and then I had created each of the buttons to have the word on them. But for many reasons, this is not really a suitable choice. We're going to make this into an NPatch button. The first thing I need to do is get rid of this text. Now I need to think about where the edges of the button are going to be. So we need 36 in height and 19 in width. Now what I'm going to do is copy each of these pieces into my new image. Alright, now this looks pretty wild. It really just looks like a tiny circular button, but realistically this is all we need to be able to draw a button that looks like this. Realistically, making it this small isn't actually that helpful. Now it's going to be very difficult to know the correct way to tile it, but I know the values, so I'm just going to go plug them in. So coming back to this example, let's load this texture and try to create the NPatchInfo. Okay, so it took a little bit of playing around, but now I have the button drawing, I've got some text on it, I've got an example of what it would look like if I didn't use NPatch at all. Of course, I'm not drawing text on that, but let's not go there. So there you have it. There's just a little example of taking a texture that you already have, slicing it up so that it can work properly with NPatch, and also just a little bonus of making it as small as you can to see that it doesn't impact the output. It still looks exactly the way that it should. There is a side-by-side with the button as it was from Photoshop or whatever I used at the time. Maybe a minor difference in the font size, but that's pretty good. With that, I think I've taken enough of your time. No source code to share this time, but please let me know in the comments if you have any questions about what I showed here today. Also, let me know in the comments if you want to see a more advanced NPatch drawing video. I'm thinking we could parameterize different behavior for the edges and the center, whether or not you want them to be stretched or tiled. We can also talk about that scaling thing I was talking about. What if I decided I wanted this shadow and the corners of this button to be more pronounced or more subtle? That would be challenging to change right now. I'd have to go and edit the texture. I hope this helps, and as always, thanks for watching.